Remember when the U.S. was poised to elect its first female president? Then the Electoral College picked Donald Trump instead? The Pink Hat March on Washington the day after Trump's inauguration captured the intense reaction many women had to that choice, and it has certainly not abated. It's added to a long trajectory of outrage, which is captured in Rebecca Traister's new book. She is writer-at-large for New York Magazine and author most recently of Good and Mad, The Revolutionary Power of Women's Anger. And Rebecca Traister joins us now for more. Great to meet you.
It's wonderful to be here.
I mean, I guess you've been on before, but
not here,
not
at this table.
We've never shaken hands before, right? Was there one? I mean, you've got a list of about 1,000 you could pick from, but was there one thing in particular that just put you over the edge and said, "That's the last straw. I got a lot to say about this. I need to write this book"?
The big thing was the election of Donald Trump. So, but it's not quite fair to say that put me over some kind of edge. There had been, I think in part it was about me changing frames and realizing how much I'd been writing about anger without realizing that I'd been writing about anger as a feminist journalist for more than 10 years. I mean, that was really what put me over the edge to write this book, was the mere suggestion, and it actually came from my husband, because anger has undergirded so much of my work. I've been writing about feminism, about gendered inequality, racial inequality, economic inequality, truly for about 15 years. Anger has obviously been underneath so much of what I do, but like so many women, I've always taken pains to sort of cover it up and not make it too aggressive or unpleasant or shrill sounding. And then in the wake of that 2016 election, I was having trouble figuring out what my responsibility was. What is okay, we're going into this Trump administration. What's my work here? What's my job? And I expressed to my husband in casual conversation, I wish I could think clearly, but I'm so angry I can't think clearly. I thought the anger was clouding my head. And he said, very casually, he's not a journalist, he said, well, maybe you should write about anger. And as soon as that barest suggestion was made, suddenly everything came into a kind of focus. And instead of being a muddying force, suddenly I saw anger as this very clear thread running underneath so much of the history that I myself have only recently learned about in terms of the catalytic, the transformative social and political movements that have reshaped the United States and its history and its government, and the politics that I cover as a journalist. And I was like, anger is a connecting thread between past, present, and I think moving us into the future. And when it comes to women, there's such a story that hasn't been told about it. That afternoon in my head had the outline of what this book turns out to be, even though much of the meat of this book hadn't even happened yet. So it was before the Women's March, it was before historic numbers of women ran for office, it was before the #MeToo movement. And yet the outlines of what this book was going to be made themselves clear in that one afternoon.
Here's an excerpt from the book. Here it was, an anger that was so intense, it blazed its way via stupid hats and foul-mouthed tirades, even from the most official and respectable sources. Anything to let people know this: women were furious. After the election, everything that had been restrained and secret and muffled could no longer be contained beneath a veneer of, quote, going high or venting only to the like-minded. Of all the feelings that have surfaced since January, sadness, depression, hopelessness, rare bits of joy, wrote the feminist journalist Samita Mukhopadhyay at the end of 2017, the one that has sustained, motivated, and sometimes felt like it was destroying me has been anger. What does Trump represent to women who feel as you do?
Well, I think he represents so much that is unjust on one very symbolic level. Having watched him, and this is especially in the wake of the anger that had erupted before his election, because remember there was the Access Hollywood tape in which, a month before he was elected, in which he was recorded bragging about grabbing a woman against her will. And that had produced, we forget about it.
He was a little more explicit than that.
He was more explicit than that. Yeah. But we forget that it provoked a sort of pre-Me Too campaign. Millions of women telling stories, many of them for the first time, about how they'd been groped or assaulted or harassed. Women were furious. I remember friends of mine wheeling around on their cat collars in those weeks because they thought Hillary Clinton was going to be the president, wheeling around and saying, you can't talk to me that way anymore. It's going to be a new world. There was this sense that there was this tremendous anger, in addition to the anger at the racism, the open racism and xenophobia on which he ran, the open, disregard for women, for people of color. He ran a fairly grotesque rhetorical campaign. And there was this sense, and I think many people also felt that he was completely unqualified for the job at hand. And there was this overconfidence, as we know, that Hillary Clinton was going to beat him handily. And then when she didn't, it stood in. It was this massive electoral result and a surprise to many people,
including Donald Trump.
Including Donald Trump. And yet, for so many women, this big news story was so familiar to them. The idea of a qualified, whatever you thought of her, an extremely smart and qualified, prepared female candidate for a job, losing that job to a wholly unqualified toddler who's been reported to HR and nonetheless gets the promotion, was recognizable from their own lives, that it was like just another Tuesday in America.
Another example of the unfairness of it all.
And it sort of highlighted certain kinds of injustice. Now, then once he was in office, things like the Muslim travel ban, the immigration policies, the bans on transgender people in the military, those things began to... Donald Trump's presidency has made clear a lot of things that were covered up in the American right-wing Republican Party of the past couple of decades as it has been moving further and further right. I don't think he's so distinct from the party that helped to elect him and that continues to support him. I don't think he's this, outlier ideologically. The difference is he says it all out loud. But in saying it all out loud, it provokes a sort of, there's no deniability in terms of what he's trying to do. And that gives people permission and space to be openly mad without anybody telling them there's nothing to be mad about.
Another excerpt from the book. It is, in fact, an anger on behalf of the nation's suppressed majority, and therefore especially frightening and combustible because of the threat it poses to the minority. We are primed to hear the anger of men as stirring, downright American, as our national lullaby, and primed to hear the sound of women demanding freedom as the screech of nails on our national chalkboard. That's because women's freedom would, in fact, circumscribe white male dominion. Why do you think, here we are in 2018 already, why do you think there has not been the kind of progress on these issues that you'd like to see so far?
Well, the United States was, in fact, built on white patriarchal power structures. And it's a great irony because in the United States, we fetishize our founding narrative. We absolutely, this is like the national lullaby, is the story of the founders and their righteous break from England because they were being taxed without being represented in government. And the sort of patriotic calls for liberty and equality are the things that's like a national catechism in the United States. This is what we're founded on as a democracy, a representative democracy. But in fact, the thing we talk much less about, or certainly not taught clearly in schools as young people, is that the new country that they set up was built from the start, obviously on the exclusion and the subjugation of masses of its population. The enslavement of African Americans, written into the founding documents, is the fact that they're not even treated as fully human. The lack of a franchise for women, also building an economy, the government, on the labor of enslaved people and the domestic labor, the unpaid domestic labor of women. And that's how the country enriched itself. It's how it gained its economic power. And its laws, its courts, its government, its economy is all built on that. And it's very hard. It's been 200 years.
250 years.
And we have chipped away at it. People got the franchise, although note that even that battle in the United States is very much at the heart of the headlines that we are reading this week, because it was, a 90-year suffrage battle for women. And the 19th Amendment really covered primarily white women because at that point, black women and black men in the Jim Crow South
still disenfranchised.
Were disenfranchised. Yeah. Then it's another 45 years to the Voting Rights Act of 1965. Well, during the Obama administration, the John Roberts Supreme Court gutted the Voting Rights Act, enabling all kinds of voter suppression that you're seeing play out in the midterm elections in states like Georgia and North Dakota and Florida. So the fight for enfranchisement is 250 years old, and it is still very much at issue in terms of who gets to vote and who gets to have their votes counted.
Wouldn't you have thought, though, that after 250 years you'd have made more progress by now?
I think when you build an entire nation on these inequities,
I get it.
It's hard to change, but we're doing it. We have made a lot of progress. I don't want to deny that.
I do need to ask you about a couple of things that have been just overwhelming American society for the last year. And so we're just going to tackle them head on here. Harvey Weinstein. Lots of people knew about it. You heard stories over the years. Why did it take so long to stop him?
Well, there was not a lot of evidence on hand that people were going to care. And when I say that, I mean that very seriously. Charges of sexual harassment against Bill O'Reilly, for example, were made public. A woman with a name attached came forward. Bill O'Reilly, nothing happened to him. He paid off the woman in a settlement. It was reported. It was widely reported. He kept his multi-million-dollar powerful seat at Fox News for decades afterwards. Bill Cosby. The stories of Bill Cosby's alleged rapes of multiple women were public, in the public domain. They were not kept secret. He still kept getting Lifetime Achievement Awards, hailed as a comedic hero. Nothing happened to Bill Cosby for a long time.
The culture doesn't care about it.
Donald Trump was elected president after, right? There was all kinds of evidence that said, what difference would it make? In addition, there were all kinds of mechanisms in place, non-disclosure agreements, payouts, because you're talking, in many cases, when you talk about many of the men who were publicly accused of sexual misconduct during the #MeToo period, you're talking about men who had immense power over the careers, not just of the people that they allegedly harassed, but people who were invested in them maintaining their jobs because they were economically dependent on them, professionally dependent on them.
Okay, so that's why it took so long.
Yeah.
What finally brought it to an end?
Well, I think there was a mass level of boiling fury. And we had seen it in these other iterations. The Women's March, that was the biggest single-day political protest in United States history. Record numbers, tens of thousands of women signing up to run for office, teacher strikes. There were indications that women were so angry, and so many women were so angry, that there was this kind of boiling over point. And I think that happened to hit at the moment that finally reporters were able to tell the story of Harvey Weinstein. And once that hit, I was shocked by the reaction. I'd known the Weinstein stories for years. I had known the impossibility of reporting them. I tried to help other reporters do it. When it was finally told,
the dam burst.
It was a hot match to, a bunch of tinder.
Yep.
Women were so livid at what had become so clear to so many of them. And here was this story, not only of grotesque and violent behavior and misconduct, but of the fact that for years he'd been getting away with it, been rewarded for it in many cases. And it just created a conflagration. And then it became other people, the intensity of the anger, and the interest that it drew permitted other people to tell other stories about other harassers and predators. And then it became the story of how common this behavior was. So it created waves. And by the way, the most intense period of that was the fall of 2017, but it continues a year later. The grotesque stories about the CBS chief Les Moonves, those were published just 8 weeks ago. Stories about sexual misconduct at Google, being sort of rewarded with multi-million-dollar payoffs for those alleged to be badly behaved. These stories are still coming. I don't think Me Too is over, though the most intense period was certainly last fall.
Well, let me ask you about the second thing that was very dominant and overwhelming more recently, and that is, of course, the Supreme Court hearings into Brett Kavanaugh. I don't know too many, I was about to say I don't know too many people. I'm not sure I know anybody who didn't watch some of that at least.
Right.
How did that contribute to the current climate of anger that you see right now?
Well, I think it probably wouldn't have happened if we hadn't had the 2 years preceding. There were a very distinct set of circumstances that permitted, for example, Christine Blasey Ford to think that it might be worth reaching out to her representative and telling her about her experience. There were a distinct set of circumstances that led reporters to say, hey, this is an important, relevant fact. There was a distinct set of circumstances that led, for example, Mazie Hirono, the senator from Hawaii who was on the Senate Judiciary Committee, to have been asking all judiciary nominees over the previous year whether they'd ever harassed anyone. The question of whether a powerful figure had participated in harassment or assault was one that seemed relevant in a way that, again, it hadn't ever seemed to be relevant previously. And in fact, the one example that we had of exactly this, Clarence Thomas being publicly accused of sexually harassing Anita Hill in 1991 during his confirmation hearings for the Supreme Court, again, like Trump, like Bill, he'd gotten on the court anyway and has shaped law there ever since. So there wasn't evidence that this would necessarily stop the further accrual of power by a judge, except that the climate had contributed to the fact that reporters were taking it seriously enough to report on, and then it became a question of whether there would be hearings.
Okay, let's go back to partisan politics here, and I do want to talk about Hillary Clinton, because you can't talk about this without talking about some of the double standards that existed during the course of that 2016 presidential campaign. To be sure, she was not a perfect candidate.
Nope.
To be sure, she gave a speech at Goldman Sachs for $250,000 and then tried to portray herself as a champion of the little guy against Wall Street, which is a pretty hard thing to do. She didn't campaign behind the big blue fortress in some of those states, which she ended up losing. An establishment candidate in a year of disruption and anti-establishment fervor. Is it fair to blame her defeat on misogyny?
I don't think it's a question. I don't think any sort of monocausal explanation for what happened in 2016 is going to get us very far.
Okay.
There are so many factors contributing. To the degree that I cover women in politics, the particular thing that I write about very often with Hillary Clinton, and I've covered her for many years, is the degree to which gender and misogyny, it's not just a question of blame, have contributed to shaping who she is, her career, her life, her marriage, her public persona, the range of expression she had available to her rhetorically as a politician. All that stuff, it's impossible to disentangle it from gender. And so that's part of what I look at, but I would never go so far as to say she lost because of sexism. She lost for all kinds of
Sure.
reasons that are tied to the ones that you're talking about.
So tell me this, in the middle of that presidential debate, when Trump was kind of, lurking behind her.
Menacing, pawing the ground,
Yeah.
snorting, yes.
Yeah, and she had to make a decision, do I call him on it and turn around and, bust his chops for it, or do I just keep calm and carry on? She chose the latter. What should she have done?
Well, I think she chose correctly. I mean, to put no finer point on it, it sucks that these are the options available. Because, we'd like to think that we're the kind of public that would see that and say, yes, you go. But the fact is, let's try to imagine if that had happened. And she does. She second guesses it now.
In her own book, she did.
In her own book.
Yeah.
And she described to me in an interview afterwards how much math she was doing in her own head. Do I turn around and say, get away from me? Do I not? Is it going to? And she says it's going to redound negatively to me. Now, later she says, maybe I should have done it. Let's imagine that she turned around on him and said, get away from me. We would like to think, in retrospect, because we always flatter ourselves, that we would have said, you go, way to go. But let's be real about what would have happened. Was Hillary Clinton playing the gender card? Was she behaving like a victim? Was she trying to did she feel like she wasn't doing well in the debate and had to turn it into a defensive, there would have been
She couldn't win.
There was no way that was going to come off well. I think she chose correctly. It's too bad. Just as it is too bad that Christine Blasey Ford could not have raised her voice in anger, that there are these, and be taken seriously.
I'm surprised by your answer. I got to tell you, you've written a book called Good and Mad. In some respects, you want North American women, you want women worldwide to start to demonstrably indicate that they have had enough. And yet here's this moment, and in fact, the whole presidency might have rested on this one moment in the debate where some people were looking at Hillary Clinton and said, now's your moment not to be calculating, now's your moment to show some righteous indignation to what you're experiencing, and she didn't. And you're okay with that.
Well, okay with that. It's the system in which we live. But what I said was, it sucks. So the book is not advocating. I want to be really clear, because I think that there's the assumption that what the book is saying is like, give them hell, rage on, right? It's
No,
not.
you're just describing what is there.
Right, but to the degree that there is anything prescriptive, it's actually not about the expression of anger. It's not about raise your voice louder, or, to hell with the system that tells you have to be polite or solicitous, get mad. It's about, to the degree that it's prescriptive, it's about let's listen for women's anger differently and start to value it differently, because the fact is, women are operating in worlds in which their anger undermines their point, in which had Hillary Clinton whirled around on Donald Trump, she would have paid a political price, in which
So unfairly undermines their
yes,
anger.
the part of what the book does is outline the way in which a power system, in which those in power, in which the way our expectations of female expression have been aligned, condemn women for showing anger where there's real risk. And we're talking about Hillary Clinton or Christine Blasey Ford. If you're a woman of color in the United States and you're, say, pulled over for no reason, you have every right to be blazing mad. But if you get mad at that arresting officer, you run the risk of incarceration, arrest, being shot. There are real tolls. You can be mad in your office about something that has been incredibly unjust, and you have every reason to be mad. But if you scream back at your boss, the reputation you can get is as difficult. You might not get your promotion. You might lose your job. So I don't want to go out and advocate to anybody like, go get mad. What I want to do is say, look, there is a system out there that penalizes women unfairly, doesn't take their rage seriously, assumes it to be irrational, and we need to alter that system. How do we do that? It's not by expressing ourselves differently. It's about listening for the people around us who are expressing themselves and not being taken seriously. So this is a book about...
The message is less to the women and more to the
Well,
to the
it's
other
to women to listen to other women. It's to everybody to say, look at how this works, or even identify those patterns. Consider why it was that Hillary Clinton couldn't turn around on Donald Trump.
And yet, okay, I hear you there. Tell me this, though. Donald Trump got the majority of votes from white women.
Yes, he did.
There has never been a white woman more qualified to be president of the United States than Hillary Clinton, and she didn't get the majority of votes from people who were like her.
Right.
Explain that to me.
Well, women have never voted as a cohesive bloc, ever in the history of women voting. And in fact, one of the key things that we have to acknowledge when we talk about women as a bloc is the way that...
Of course, more diverse than...
More diverse, but not only that, the way that... I mean, I mentioned earlier that the United States is built around white patriarchal power structures. Well, not only is the patriarchy part important there, the white is important there. And white women have always voted conservatively. Since we've been tracking these things, which is 1952, white women have voted for Republican candidates. The majority of them have supported Republican candidates in all but 2 elections, 92 and 96. 92, they voted for Bill Clinton. Bill Clinton ran on a very racially charged, tough-on-crime campaign platform. He left the campaign trail to go execute Ricky Ray Rector, an African-American man in Arkansas who had sustained an injury and had disabilities. White women voted for Bill Clinton. Then the only reason that a majority, 96 is more confusing because a percentage of white women voted for Ross Perot, who was a third-party candidate. But even before 1952, a lot of the arguments for women's suffrage during the suffrage movement of the late 19th, early 20th century were based on the idea that white women would cancel out the votes of African-American men who'd been enfranchised after emancipation. So the idea that white women would not operate alongside their sisters of other races or on behalf of women and women's rights, but instead support white male power has been long entrenched. This has always been one of the ideas behind the question of the enfranchisement of white women.
Are you saying they're voting against their own self-interest by doing that?
Well, in one sense they are, in that yes, patriarchy oppresses them, and even Christine Blasey Ford is a great example of even white women who are theoretically protected within white patriarchy and enjoy white supremacy. Well, they're still not believed. They're often harassed. This is also true of many of the very wealthy, privileged white women who accused Harvey Weinstein and others. However, white supremacy is in their own interest. There is, a lot of, and we can't pretend that that's not in play when we talk about how white women vote. Now, interestingly, in the midterms, the first numbers were really grim on white women voting, and I'm still getting a lot of the numbers. It does look as though white suburban women moved pretty sharply toward the Democratic side during these midterm elections.
I want to talk for a moment, not about a white woman, but an African-American woman.
Yes.
Michelle Obama. Have you ever met her?
Yes, I have.
Yes?
I have. Very early. In 2007, I got to profile her when she was campaigning in Iowa.
There's the cover of the National Review, which is a conservative publication, and it's called, well, there's the headline, Mrs. Grievance. What was the story behind all of that?
Well, in terms of how women's anger is penalized, almost no one's anger is as penalized as Black women's anger in the United States. And a lot of black women talk about the presumption, the caricature of angry black womanhood is so intense and so pervasive that lots of black women talk about the assumption that they're angry when they walk into a room, whether they've even opened their mouths. There is a way in which black women's anger is made into a cartoon, a kind of entertainment of a neck-snapping, side-eye casting black woman. Often white women turn to those kinds of memes and GIFs on social media, for example, you know, a Beyonce GIF or Maxine Waters looking over her glasses to express their own anger, which is interesting. I write about this in the book. It's interesting because the white women aren't putting themselves on the line by saying, I'm angry. They're using the expression of a black woman to convey their anger, and it's the black woman who gets penalized, as Maxine Waters has been, for instance. But this is part of what...
we should just say, she's a California congresswoman.
I'm sorry, California congresswoman Maxine Waters has been. But this is one of the things that happened to Michelle Obama. When she's on the campaign trail in 2007, 2008, she is charismatic, warm. I mean, Michelle Obama, one of the warmest, funniest, frankest first ladies we could possibly think of. And she was very warm and loving, obviously, toward her husband, but she sort of made some cutting remarks about him, funny, ribbing him about being snorey and stinky, and someday
he's still got to take out the garbage.
Yes, exactly. And it wasn't just a right-wing media. Maureen Dowd, a columnist in the New York Times, went after her for being emasculating. That was at the very beginning. And then while on the campaign trail, I believe it was after he won Iowa, she made what I thought of as a very forward-looking, warm comment, saying this is one of the first times I'm proud of my country. In terms of making that kind of progress we were talking about earlier.
She got clobbered for that.
She was characterized instantaneously as the angry black woman. You can see from that National Review cover. She was on lots of magazine covers. And she rarely made angry faces. That was probably her making a joke, right? Whenever that photo was taken, she was not an angry persona at all. But pictures of her with her mouth open, her brows knit. There were other headlines, why is Michelle Obama so angry? And this is the other thing that happens to black women if they are angry, especially if they're in a position that threatens whiteness and white men. And here's Michelle Obama, about to become the first black woman to move into the White House. She was certainly in a position that was threatening a history of whiteness in that White House, right? And the way in which she was turned into a threatening cartoon, she was on the cover of the New Yorker, literally, the New Yorker magazine, literally as a cartoon of a Black Power advocate. After, I believe, the night he clinched the nomination, they dapped. There was a dap, a fist. They fist bumped.
The terrorist fist bump.
The terrorist fist jab, as it was called. So, and you can see.
In fairness, only on Fox.
Only on Fox. But this is very akin to how the anger of and again with Michelle Obama, it wasn't even anger, but it's anger is so useful in damaging vulnerable people by saying, oh, they're angry and therefore dangerous. I mean, this is something that seems completely unrelated. Black Lives Matter, a peaceful group born out of anger at police killings of African Americans, are characterized also on Fox very often as a terrorist group, as a mob, as thugs. Meghan McCain, the daughter of Arizona Senator John McCain, once called them a hate group. The way in which often anger at inequity or injustice is characterized itself as disruptive, chaotic, aggressive, dangerous, threatening. And that's Michelle Obama, and in fact, the way that many black women, powerful black women, are treated as threatening, militant forces is a great example of that.
Well, let me follow up with another angle on Fox News, which is there are lots of angry women on Fox. Judge Jeanine Pirro, Laura Ingraham, Elizabeth Hasselbeck. Do you respect their anger as well? They're angry about different things than you are, but they're angry.
Here's what I would say. I disagree with their anger entirely. Here's the degree to which I respect it is to say that it is potent. Women's anger is not always progressive. We spoke earlier about white women who have historically supported conservative and white patriarchal politics and power structures. White women are very often angry on behalf of a white patriarchy in a way in which is very, very powerful. you can look back further to Phyllis Schlafly, who led an army of white women in the 1980s against the ratification of the Equal Rights Amendment. It had gotten through Congress with bipartisan support. It needed to be ratified in a certain number of states. And Phyllis Schlafly marshaled the forces of conservative white women in the United States to fight back against the ratification of that ERA, and she won.
She won. Yep.
So to say, no, do I respect it ideologically? Not in the least. I couldn't be more opposed to it. The anger of Sarah Palin, the former vice presidential candidate in 2008. She would go on in 2010 to help lead the charge of the far-right Tea Party in the United States under the, she called herself a mama grizzly. And in fact, one of the ways in which white women's anger is often celebrated culturally is if it is on behalf of a white patriarchy, not challenging it. And of course, Sarah Palin, working on behalf of a Republican Party, was doing just that.
I want to give you an example, though, of a black woman who recently got angry in public, big time, and seemed to have a lot of support behind her. Serena Williams at the U.S. Open Tennis Championships. The umpires made a call that was controversial, let's put it that way. And she reacted with ire, total ire. And the public was with her. What do you infer from that?
Well, the public was with her. It's interesting that you see that as the public having been with her. That's
you don't think they were?
Well, at the match they were. The crowd was with her. Certainly, they were cheering her. And I think, by the way, that in part, that is also a product of the moment. I think there was such a hyper-awareness of the dynamics that were in play on that night that the fact that we have had a robust conversation about Serena Williams and that finals match is indicative of the way that we are trying to hear anger differently and understand its dimensions. So the public may have been with her, the crowd may have been with her. She was the superstar that night, and she was in a very dramatic position of
there were extenuating circumstances. She was on the comeback trail. She was the local girl. The other tennis player was from another country.
And my view of what happened that night is that those extenuating circumstances can't be taken out of. I've had several, disagreements about this. Lots of people who say, "Listen, I'm a tennis fan. She broke a racket. That's just clean and simple. She gets that right." My view is that you can't, when it comes to Serena Williams, you can't take race and gender out of the picture because the sport that she has dominated now for several years has historically been such a white sport, and her presence in it has never been treated easily, or she hasn't been treated with the kind of respect and legitimacy, even as she's helped to remake that sport. She has deep fandom. I'm not questioning.
Cover of the New York Times Magazine is the greatest athlete of our time.
She absolutely has been, but she's also had her dress, her outfits,
criticized,
banned, not only criticized, banned by the French Open in this past year. I think you can't, the circumstances behind that match, you can't separate from her race and gender, including the fact that she had to come back from having been unseated after having a baby. We know, that's related to her gender. That doesn't happen to male players when they have a baby. That the health problems that she'd had are tied to black maternal health Black women's maternal health and mortality rates in ways that are really close. She'd had her symptoms kind of ignored, and she's an extremely powerful, wealthy woman and suffered certain medical diagnoses that had led her to have to wear different kinds of clothing, which then is censored. And when it gets to what happened in that match, I think it really matters, before we get to the racket being broken, that the very first warning that she got, which was for this coaching, that her coach had given her a signal, it worked. The thing she got so mad about was this suggestion that there was something illegitimate about her play, that she cheated.
That she cheated, right.
You're calling me a cheat. And I don't think the level of fury that she was provoked to by that particular warning, before she'd lost a point, before she'd lost a game, that was about questioning the legitimacy of her being on that court. And I think you cannot separate that from her history within this sport.
Okay. So I shouldn't get too excited that that's an example of progress.
No, the progress is we had the conversation about it.
Yes, we did.
The progress is that people wrote a lot of smart things and said a lot of smart things about it, and that we had fights about it.
Okay. I want to ask you about, just in our remaining moments here, let me ask you about the March on Washington. And in fact, all around the world, echoed all around the world, the day after Donald Trump's inauguration. Did that accomplish anything?
Oh, yeah.
What did it accomplish?
Well, it brought a lot of people who had never previously been involved in protest and who had never held a sign in the air before, or never thrown a fist in the air. It brought a lot of people into civic participation in a way that they found exciting. It also, one of the things I argue in this book is that while people think of anger as only divisive or destructive, and it has those qualities, I don't mean to behave as though it doesn't, we never talk about how it can be connective. And the anger that brought so many of those women out into the streets, not just in Washington, but in Alaska and in Antarctica and in Toronto.
Yep. On that day, though, Rebecca, on that day,
it brought people.
Did it have legs?
Yes.
Okay, tell me how.
That's where people decided, met each other, realized that they were not alone, realized that they were part of potentially a movement or a coalition of people who were angry at how things were, that they could run for office, that they could organize on behalf of other people who are running for office, that there were other women from other places around the world who felt the same as they.
Okay, if those were the seeds that were planted,
yes.
What were the buds that sprouted?
In the United States, we just elected 110 women to the House of Representatives and gubernatorial mansions.
Unprecedented.
Unprecedented, historic. The Me Too movement itself, as we talked about, I think sprung from some of that anger. Not only that, within a week of that Women's March, you had the protests against the travel ban, the Muslim ban, people rushing to airports, not just to hold protest signs, so they did that, but to write out the writs of habeas corpus to help get people do actual politically consequential, personally consequential things to help those who'd been detained. The majority of those people, the protesters at those airports, were women. Within a few months of that, the Republican Congress had the full ability to repeal healthcare reform, repeal Obamacare. There was a mass protest, millions of calls and letters placed to members of the Senate. The majority, lots of studies found that something like 85% of those doing the calling and the writing to the senators every day for that period in the spring of 2017 were women. It worked. It applied enough pressure that 3 Republicans voted against the repeal of Obamacare. Obamacare didn't get repealed in that vote. So all of that is stemming from a lot of the same impulse to participate in civic challenge, civic education, and civic engagement that we saw first in this mass women's march.
I have one more question for you, and it's about this page of your book.
Yes.
Who are Bella and Rosie?
They are my daughters.
And what kind of America do you think they're going to grow up in?
I don't know. I don't know. I think that's an open question. And I think that many of us are engaged in what we have to understand is a fight that's going to last beyond my lifetime and probably through theirs. And I think that the era in which I was born, in which part of the messages that I was sent when I was their age, not necessarily by my parents who are politically engaged people, but by a culture and a pop culture, was that there was nothing left to be angry about. We'd fixed the problems and that there weren't big fights to be had. And if there's one thing that I want them and so many others to know, it's that there's an enormous amount to still be angry about, an enormous amount to fight about. I'm going to spend the rest of my life fighting for it, and I strongly suspect that they will spend their lives fighting too.
Well, you've certainly given us 250 pages of stuff to be good and mad about. I can't thank you enough for coming up to Toronto and for being on this set to have this conversation. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much.
That's Rebecca Traister, Good and Mad, the revolutionary power of women's anger.
The Agenda with Steve Paikin is brought to you by the Chartered Professional Accountants of Ontario, helping businesses stay on the right side of change with strategic thinking, insightful decisions, and business leadership. Are you on the right side of change? Ask an Ontario CPA.